Hey, welcome everyone to Engaging the Mind, where we are not afraid to tackle the hard issues of every day. Well, I've got some news to share with you on this podcast that is exciting to me. I just spent 2 days at an abolition conference. And we rallied at the Capitol, and then I went to a conference on Tuesday night and watched the conference through Facebook Live on my phone on Monday, and a lot of interesting things that I'd like to share with you today on this podcast. But there was one sermon that was preached, a lot of great sermons, by the way, but there was one sermon in particular that was preached that really just grabbed a hold of my heart as we talk about the issue of abolishing abortion. And so I want to get to that here in just a moment. But before I do, let me read to you a quote from a book that I started reading. I had it in my library. I pulled it off my shelf, and I decided that I'm going to read the whole thing. And here it is. It's entitled, A Practical View of Prevailing Religious Systems of Professed Christians in the Higher and Middle Classes in the Country Contrasted with Real Christianity. Now, this is written by William Wilberforce. Now, that's a long title, but basically he's talking about what's real Christianity. Now, remember, Wilberforce was one of the abolitionists of slavery. He fought hard to free the slaves, and so listen to what he said about the life of Christians in his day. He said this, and I quote, "In that which we are most concerned to know, how great must be the guilt and how awful the punishment of voluntary ignorance." So you had slavery going on, and Wilberforce said that for the most part, Christianity in his day was willfully ignorant. The sin of willful ignorance. Now, beloved, I believe that's where we're at today. Now, the issue is not slavery, but the issue is abortion. And I'm just amazed at the amount of pastors and churches, Christian leaders, who are just choosing to be willfully, sinfully ignorant on the issue of pro-life versus abolition, pro-life legislation versus bills of abolition. We have people, listen, and maybe you're one of them, I hope not, but we have people that are choosing to be willfully ignorant. Why? Because once you know the truth, you've got to do something about it, or at least I hope you would. And so some people just don't want to know. They don't want to know. They don't want to hear about it. They want to remain ignorant. And as a matter of fact, when they do hear about it and they're confronted with it, oftentimes they get mad. And the reason they get mad is hopefully because of the conviction of the Holy Spirit that's being placed on their heart. Now, Wilberforce goes on to say this. Now, listen to what he says. "And why we are in this pursuit alone, we expect knowledge without inquiry and success without endeavor." He says, listen, we live in a society today where people, they want knowledge, but they don't want to inquire on how to get it. They want success, but they don't want to endeavor. Now let's apply these principles to the fight against abortion right now. Are we not seeing Christians who expect knowledge, but they don't want to inquire about it? They don't want to study it. They don't want to research about what's going on. That's where I was. I didn't want to hear about abolition. I was committed to the pro-life cause, and I was unwilling to research and to learn and to listen. I had my neck was bowed, and I was committed to going in one direction. And in reality, I wanted knowledge without inquiry, and I was choosing to be willfully ignorant. I wanted success without endeavor. And so I pray that you'll continue to listen to these podcasts. Now, the sermon that I heard was given by Jeff Durbin. I heard a lot of great messages, not saying that anybody's message was not good, but Jeff Durbin preached a message, and you ought to check him out. He has his own ministry. He's a pastor, has his own podcast, Apologia. And so, but he preached a message that God used to just really grab a hold of my heart. And I want to share with you in this podcast some of those things that Jeff Durbin preached on. All right. So please listen with an open heart. Now, he talked about Romans chapter 13, which I agree with him that this is probably one of the most misquoted passages of Scripture in our day today. Now, let me remind you of what Romans 13 says. Romans 13, verse 1, it says, "Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God." Now think about that. There is no authority except from God. And again, the context of which he's talking about here is government. So that means that every legislator, whether they're a representative or a senator or a governor, every branch of legislation, every legislator has their authority from God. God has them in that position to be under his authority and to exercise his authority. He says, "For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Now, some people will say, well, separation of church and state, the legislature cannot do what the church is supposed to do. Well, let me just clarify something. According to the authority of God, the church has the responsibility to preach the gospel. That's what God has told the church to do. We are to take the gospel to the nations. And the government is to implement justice. Our roles are different between civil government and the church. The church is to preach the gospel, and the states are to uphold justice. Now, here's what I want you to think about. Even though there is a distinct difference in the role, both are under the authority of God. So don't buy into this argument, well, we've got all these preachers coming up to the Capitol, and they think that the legislator is supposed to behave like the church. No, we don't. But what we are telling you is that you are under the authority of God. You have been placed in that position by God, and you have a biblical responsibility to seek and to uphold justice. Justice. And that justice is to be extended not just to the born, but also to the preborn. Now, a couple of other things I want to address, and that's a big one. And so if there is a legislator watching this, and I pray that you'll just think about what I just said, that according to Romans 13, that you have a God-given responsibility, a command, because you are under the authority of the Lordship of Jesus Christ, to uphold justice. Now, why is justice important? Why am I emphasizing justice? Well, first of all, because the Bible does. I've been preaching through the book of Revelation for some time now, and just recently I preached Revelation 15 and Revelation 16, and in both of those chapters, the justice of God is the theme. For example, he says in Revelation 15, latter part of verse 3, he says, "Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord the Almighty. Just and true are your ways." And then when you look in chapter 16, again in verse 5, he says, "I heard the angel in charge of the water say, just are you, O Holy One." God is just. God is holy. And the state's job is to uphold justice. I emphasize that because one of the biggest arguments against bills of abolition is criminalization. That was my argument for a long time when I was helping out with pro-life legislation, going to the Capitol lobbying. When I would argue against abolition, I would always say that I'm not for abolition. Why? Because it seeks to criminalize the mother. Okay. That is a fatal flaw. And I'm going to tell you why. Because in that argument, you are saying that you believe that the mother is a victim. And to criminalize her is to further victimize her. I would say to you that that is an emotional argument. Okay, I get it. We are emotional people, and that is an emotional argument. And for my pastors out there, I understand. That's a pastoral argument. But it's not a biblical argument. Let me tell you what I mean. Because we believe that the baby inside the womb, at the moment of conception, that the baby in the womb is 100% human, just as the baby is outside of the womb. We believe if a baby is murdered outside the womb, the state should uphold justice. What we're unwilling to say, and really it's an act of hypocrisy, what we're unwilling to say is that if a baby's murdered inside the womb, that the state should uphold justice. The reality is, biblically speaking, justice should be upheld in both cases. People think that, well, if we criminalize abortion and that we're going to have all these women being thrown into prison. No, the reality is that when you criminalize abortion, women stop having abortions. Of course, there'll be some who will seek one out and they'll seek to undermine the law or they'll go to another state or whatever it may be. But the reality is that when we uphold the law and when we say that abortion is murder and it is going to be criminalized, women will then be schooled by the law. The law then becomes a teacher. Just like in the Old Testament, why did God give his law to his people? The law was a schoolmaster. The law was a teacher. It's no different in civil government. We have laws because the laws teach us, but help teach us between what's right and what's wrong. Abortion is wrong. Abortion is murder. It is not right to murder a baby inside the womb. And it ought to be criminalized. That's biblical. God is a just God. And we need laws in place to serve as a safeguard, to serve as a teacher to women and to men, so that they'll understand that it's a criminal offense, so that they'll understand that it is murder, therefore they won't go have an abortion. You know why women have abortions today? Because they think it's okay. They think it's okay. Why do they think it's okay? Because the law says they can do it. We need laws in place that say, no, it's a criminal offense. It's murder. And it's the state's role to uphold justice. Not just for the born babies, but for the preborn babies. And church, we have a responsibility to rise up and to demand that justice be upheld for our preborn neighbors. You can't remain willfully ignorant and think you're going to get away with that. You will one day have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account. It matters to God. Now, let me give you a case study for a moment. Now, in the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 20, now, and I hope my audience is pastors and legislators. I hope I have them listening. I do know I have some legislators who watch this podcast because they told me so. And so, brothers, hear my plea. Exodus 20, verse 13 says, you shall not murder. I mean, that's 10 Commandments, right? You shall not murder. That's Exodus 20. But then when you move into Exodus 21, he tells us what will happen if you do murder? Okay, you shouldn't murder, but if you do, this is what's going to happen. Now listen to what he says. When men strive together and they hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there's no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But listen to this. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. God says, listen, if two men are fighting and they hit a pregnant woman and it causes her to go into labor and she has a baby and the baby's fine, then you are to pay restitution. But if two men are fighting and the woman dies and her baby dies, he says justice for both. Equal justice. Equal justice. I mean, we even have laws on the books right now that say, if a man's drunk and he's driving down the road and he hits a pregnant woman, he's guilty of double, and she loses her baby, she dies and her baby dies, it's a double homicide. Notice the hypocrisy. Notice the hypocrisy in our state government as it relates to pregnant women and preborn babies. If you're a Christian, you have to believe in your heart that to kill a baby in the womb is murder. You can't remain willfully ignorant. You got to deal with it. And you also cannot deny the fact that God demands equal justice, not just for the murder of children outside the womb, but for the murder of children inside the womb. Equal justice for both. God is a just God. And it is the role of the state to uphold justice. And it's the responsibility of the church to help hold our legislators' feet to the fire. Nahum 1:3 talks about how we're not to clear the guilty. We're not to clear the guilty. Some other passages. Deuteronomy 19, verses 15 through 20 talks about purge evil from your midst. You shall not pity, etc. We're to purge evil. That's the responsibility we have. That's not only the church, it's the responsibility the civil government has. Purge evil, and your eyes shall not pity. Pity who? Those who commit a criminal offense. You're not to pity them. And that's the argument of the pro-life movement. Well, we don't want to further victimize the woman. So you're not willing to purge evil, and instead you're choosing to have pity upon someone who's murdered their child. This is tough. I know it's tough. I know this is going to lead people to get angry. I may even have some people leave my church over it. I know, but you got to understand that what I'm telling you is biblical. In no way am I trying to hurt women who have had abortions. I'm not trying to hurt families. I'm not trying to do those things. But listen here, when we tell women that it's okay to have an abortion in certain situations. And that's what pro-life legislation does. Pro-life legislation says you can kill your baby until there's a heartbeat. So it's okay to kill your baby until there's a heartbeat. That's what pro-life legislation does. So, and that's just one example. Pro-life legislation says we're going to regulate abortion, and because of regulation, it's okay to abort your baby in certain situations. Okay? That's the heart of pro-life legislation. It's okay to abort your baby in certain situations. Where abolition says it's never okay to abort your baby. Never. Well, what about in the case of the mother's health? The case of the case of the mother's life? Abolition bills say, listen, we understand that might be a possibility. So all we're saying is, in a bill of abolition, all we're saying is that not only do we want you to fight for the mother's life, we want you to fight for the baby's life as well. In other words, abolition says that every means necessary must be taken to save the life of the mother and the life of the baby. We understand that there may be times where that's not a possibility, but we want you to know that in this piece of legislation, Senate Bill 495, every effort must be taken to save both. You can't just kill the baby because it's an inconvenience. That would be murder. And if you do that, you're going to be criminalized for it. Because that's what God does. I mean, let me just read to you another passage of Scripture. I read this to my staff in our staff meeting the other day in the book of Ezekiel. Hang with me. Listen to this. God says in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 20, "And you took your sons and your daughters, whom you had borne to me, and these you sacrificed to them to be devoured." He says, listen, you sacrificed, talking about the nation of Israel. He says, you sacrificed your kids to false gods. And he says, were your whorings so small a matter? God called them whores because they sacrificed their kids. And God says, did you think this was a small matter? This is not a small matter. It's not a small matter to regulate abortion. It's never okay, beloved. It's never okay. Hear me. To abort your baby. He says in verse 21 that you slaughtered my children and delivered them up as an offering by fire to them, and in all your abominations and your whorings, you did not remember the days of your youth. Pretty sobering passage, isn't it? God says, listen, you're not just a whore because of sexual immorality. He says when you sacrifice your kids, you behave like a whore. And I promise you this, everybody who says that women are victims have never gone to an abortion mill and stood outside the gate and watched those women go in. I go every Monday and I stand outside the gate along with others, and we plead for women to not sacrifice their children. We plead for them to be mothers and protect their kids and choose or to protect their kids and nurture their children and birth their children. And if so, give them up for adoption. Let us help you. We provide them with resources. We tell them how, we give them other options. We do everything possible to try to stop them from making this horrific decision. And they thumb their noses at us. They flip us off. They curse. They do all these things. Because, so this idea that they know exactly what they're doing. And so I just want to encourage you to realize that God is immutable. God's unchanging. And just as God was concerned with justice for the preborn in the Old Testament, God is still concerned about justice for the preborn now. The problem is that we've become indoctrinated. We think that women are the victims in these situations. Listen, when we treat women as victims, then there's no gospel message for them. There's no gospel for them. Because when they abort their children, if they see themselves as a victim, then there's no need for the gospel. Pastors, do you understand what I'm saying? We have to tell women that abortion is wrong. It's murder. It should be criminalized. But listen, but the gospel message says that you can be forgiven. You've sinned, yes, but you can be forgiven. But when we treat them as victims, there's no gospel message. You're actually robbing women from the gospel when you refuse to talk about it as a criminal offense. And, let me just say this. Bottom line, why do state legislators, why are they so unwilling to uphold justice for our preborn neighbors, for babies in the womb? Why are they so against criminalization? Here's my perception. I'm not putting this on any of them. It's just my perception. Two things. Because deep down inside, I think that some of them believe it's okay for a woman to have an abortion. I believe deep down inside they've run pro-life. They've run on a pro-life ticket. They say they're for life, but deep down inside, some of them still think, they're not willing to come out and say it. They're not willing to be open about it. But deep down inside, some of them think it's okay for a woman to have an abortion. Some of you who might be listening to this, and I'm telling you, it's never okay. The doctors must fight for both mother and baby. Secondly, why are some legislators unwilling to criminalize abortion? Why are they unwilling to call it murder? Because I think that some of them don't believe that the baby in the womb is a human being at the moment of conception. I think they believe it comes a human being later, maybe after the heartbeat, but I think some legislators do not believe, pro-life legislators do not believe that at the moment of conception, that baby becomes a human being. If that's where you are, you need to come up front and be honest about it. And you need to say it. But I'm telling you, both of those excuses, both of those ideologies are wrong and they are against God. So, I pray that you will no longer remain willfully ignorant. That you'll stop expecting knowledge, as Wilberforce said. Stop expecting knowledge without inquiry and success without endeavor. Let us endeavor. Let us inquire. Let us fight to end abortion in the state of Oklahoma. Until we meet again, serve the King.